And if I remember right, this is kind of where we left off last Thursday, is we actually left off on this little guy on just kind of summarizing what the different basics of what each of the theories kind of states. Okay. So let's go into, we'll start with the structural functional theory and then conflict theory, and then we'll get down to the micro of symbolic interaction. Okay. So rude. So the structural functional theory, again, examines how, as we talked about last Thursday, the structures within a given society, or a given group. So if we're talking the macro level, we're talking what is the structures are the legal system, government systems, religious systems, all manufacturing and merchant systems that kind of make it so that that society can function, right? And then we ask, why do these structures exist and are they functioning properly? Is another good question that we try to look at when we're looking at these different systems. Okay. Um, and I think we talked a little bit about kind of differences in structures and functions when we talked about Hobbes and Rousseau's and the difference between United States British system and the Nordic systems in the way they approach, for example, criminal justice and those kinds of things. So that's kind of an example of this function versus and the structure and the function. But even on, like, for example, an individual group level, if when you're in a group, there's usually a person who is going to emerge as a leader, maybe more than one. There's going to be those who merge as kind of the working bees. There's going to be those who merge that are kind of the social loafers that kind of ride the car. And every group tends to have those type of structures within it. No, they're not formal structures, but they're things that kind of naturally emerge. Okay. So, the first person historically to really talk about functional theory is Herbert Spencer. And he kind of made the analogy between human biological processes and societies. He recognized that social institutions really kind of almost mimic what we see as far as organs in the body. So if you think about the human system, you have a transport system. So that could be, for example, your heart pumping blood and nutrients throughout the body. You have a food intake import system, and you have a waste export system. And each of those organs have a different function as it processes food, as an example. You have the nervous system, which is kind of the coordinator of all these systems, is kind of the executive branch. And so he recognized that really, if you look at any given social structure, especially on the societal level, there's this kind of correlation between how our body is structured, the organs of the body, and social institutions and social systems. Okay. Um, and even, the legal system is your immune system and those kinds of things. So, and he recognized, though, kind of given this analogy, is when your body is out of balance, if you have a disease in a certain organ, we can think of things like heart disease, diabetes, liver disease, all of those, that it just doesn't affect that organ. Okay. It tends to affect everything else the person is experiencing. For example, this is, um, I had a friend who got a liver infection and it started to spread upwards and downwards and ended up in the kidney. Well, in order to correct the kidney, they put him on a antibiotic that while it was fixing the kidney, it took all the good bacteria out of his colon, and then he ended up with an infected colon. And then they put him on an antibiotic to deal with that, and he ended up rupturing his spleen because of that medication. Now that's kind of the point of this example is that when you're dealing with one system, it will always have an influence on another. And he recognized within any given society, once you remove elements or kind of organs from that, or it becomes dysfunctional, it tends to influence other entities in that society. Okay. Um, so maybe some social examples or in a social system, you could look at, for example, uh, 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 power systems within the government. If they start to use and abuse that power, that can have then an influence on, for example, the economic system. It can influence the criminal justice system. It can influence all of those other systems by that power being corrupted, as you would say. If you look at, for example, when a entity moves out of a given um, um, society or situation, it always tends to end up in some type of violence interaction. Okay. Um, I'm trying to think of the example they use often. Well, probably a good example is, for example, when a natural disaster happens and it uh, has damaged a lot of the normal social structures within that system. People tend to start looting, start to break things, start to damage things, start to take advantage of things because those other systems have been put offline, as you would say, or destroyed temporarily due to some type of natural disaster or something like that. And so, just like again, the example with the organs of the body, that was kind of what he was trying to say is that everything within a society has a purpose. And when that purpose is disrupted, it can cause problems in all the other systems. Okay. Um, Durkheim used his ideas and wanted to know how society and people change over time. And he argued that the purpose of society was maintain dynamic equilibrium through what's called social facts. So social facts include laws, morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashions, ritual. And again, it goes back to our conversation last Thursday. Social facts are not facts, okay? They are mutually agreed upon ways of behaving and acting, okay? There is no um, literal fact, for example, that shaking someone's hand is necessary. It's not a rule, but what do most people do when they meet someone? You reach out your hand, right? That's considered a social fact, but it's not something that actually has to happen. It's not a fixed rule like you have in physics or something like that, okay? But he did maintain this idea of equilibrium, which also goes back to the body system that I mentioned before. The goals of medicine is to bring about equilibrium. Okay. When I talk about taking in abnormal psych in uh, when I'm talking about disorders, I talk about the medical model, which is about equilibrium. Okay. And a lot of people mistakenly who go on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines think that by taking that medication that they are going to become happier, that they're going to all of a sudden the lights will open up and the day will become good and then they find out that they actually end up feeling nothing. because a antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication is meant to bring you to equilibrium. Equilibrium in the medical model is you don't feel anything. Okay. And so this is kind of that example is that the purpose of a society is to make it so people can navigate it without risk, right? And without, so in some cases, you can walk down the street without feeling like you're going to be in danger, or you can go have a party somewhere without feeling like someone's going to be there and say, oh, you can't do this, as long as you're following the social structural rules and those social facts that go along with it. Okay. And then I think this is the last person on structural functional. This is Robert Merton. He argued that within each of these social facts or social processes, that they have multiple functions. Okay. So for example, uh, everything kind of has a manifest function and its consequences of social processes that were sought out and anticipated. Okay. Um, but with every thing that, even in the most positive light, there's also what's called the latent function and then the dysfunction. Okay. The latent function is the unsought consequences of a social process. So it is those things that people uh, didn't necessarily expect for for it to happen. Okay. And then the dysfunctions are the undesirable social consequences. Okay. You can, if you really take a good close look at every what seems to be the most positive thing we could do, there's always going to be an unsought consequence, and there's always going to be some type of dysfunction. Okay. Again, if we go back to the medication examples, when you watch uh, uh, commercials on a medication, they always say this is the manifest function. Your skin is going to clear up, or you're going to feel better, or you'll be able to get through life with no bowel issues, those kinds of things. But then they always list the latent and the dysfunctions, the side effects. And so they always list these are the other things that it possibly can do. Um, and then if we think about medications that are off-label, so for example, Ozempic, it was originally developed to control diabetes. That was its manifest function. But then the latent function is they were like, wow, people lose a lot of weight when they take this. And so originally it was marketed as purely a diabetic medication that can help with weight control and can help with heart issues. But now the latent function has basically became its manifest function as a weight control medication. And that's kind of just an example of how these can be changed. If we look at this from, for example, a social situation, um, I, I always like to use this example because it really brings up the complexity of issues. If you look at, for example, um, uh, uh, I'm going to use men who molest children, okay, or pedophiles, all right? Um, the majority of pedophiles and child sex abusers are family members, are usually the breadwinner within a home. They are usually the dad or the boyfriend. And in fact, if we counted, it's about almost greater than 90% of cases are that situation. Okay. And so a lot of manifest function, if you read what people say, we should castrate them, we should make sure they never in society again, we should electrocute them, because the manifest of that is that people tend to find that behavior irreprehensible. Okay. And so in some countries and at a point in some states, at one point, there was this idea that we're going to put these people away forever, take them out of the home, out of the situation, and they'll never be able to harm that child again. That's what we call a manifest function. Okay. However, a latent function is those policies actually promote poverty. What's the term we supposed to use now? Unhoused. It creates even more potentials of abuse. Why? Because in a lot of these situations, the house, the car, the income usually was coming from the offender that was offending that child. So while the manifest function, the abuse stops, occurs, the latent function is that you now put a family into almost a homeless, um, 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 uh, you put them in the poorhouse, as they used to say. And so, what is better, the manifest content or the latent function that then occurs to the social system in which that offender was embedded? Okay. And that's kind of the example of because we know the dysfunction, right? The undesirable social consequence is to the child who's being offended, the victim. That's the dysfunction in this. But then again, you have to think about, well, poverty and taking the offender away. So it becomes a lot more. My point in this story is is that sometimes what would be the most emotionally desirable manifest function might have equally, if not more, undesirable consequences. So those are all kind of things to think about when you think about the Merton's idea of manifest, latent versus dysfunction within any given kind of social decision we make. Okay. All right. And then the last theory that we'll be using throughout the semester is, well, it's not the last one, though. There's sub-theories too, but is conflict theory. And I'm going to kind of go through it kind of simply through this diagram, is that we live in a world that has limited resources, right? That help sustain human life. As human populations grow, it creates competition for these resources. Okay. The competition creates a class system of those who have, those who produce, and those who do not have. Okay. And well, I'll finish going through this. So those social institutions then are a reflection of that competition to try and maintain those who have versus those who don't have. And so conflict theory really highlights the issue of power and power dynamics. Okay. Um, uh, a lot of times when people talk about pre-modern life, um, they often uh, talk about what is known, the noble savage, the way we should be. And it is true that in those times, we worked under more of what's called an egalitarian society. So if you look at anthropology that studies ancient humans, they find that most of those groups were egalitarian, meaning that everyone shared. If I went out and hunt, I bring something back, even if people didn't do anything all day, we still shared because it was a community thing. Um, but the association between going from egalitarian to authoritarian society is directly related to our population growth and the development of what are known as city states. Okay, so we're talking about the development of in Europe of Greece and Rome and the Roman city and all of those different city states that then became these hubs where large amount of people were living and now have to compete for the limited resources that were available to that city state. Okay. And so we see this. So in conflict theory, this is kind of that notion that as populations grow, this, and because of the limited resource, this then can create the idea that I have to compete for what I want, because I'm either going to be the one that has or I'm going to be someone who has not. Okay. And if you really think about conflict theory, it is the basis for, at least on the social level, for the development of prejudice, discrimination, war, the idea of imaginary borders, um, and defending those imaginary borders, and all of those kinds of things. Okay. And so it becomes an important component when we start talking about those kinds of things, because even on the micro level, we can look at conflict theory, for example, between two spouses that either work together or there's the gender issues that go along with it. We can look at even some of the mass shootings and stuff and see conflict theory really playing that kind of role within those systems. Okay. So, um, and interestingly, we're going to talk about Karl Marx and conflict theory. Okay. Karl Marx, I think, is poorly dubbed as kind of the pre-founder of communism, even though he never termed the term or anything. He just came up, he went and made some observations, especially in Britain, where he went into this city and he saw there's a clear separation between people who have and people who do not have. Okay. And he recognized very quickly that the people who had stuff were exploiting the people who didn't. They were exploiting them for their labor. They were exploiting them for um, um, other social horrible reasons. And they kept them at such a low class, it was impossible for them to get out of that. Okay. Um, and he did argue for this idea that social systems need to develop that provide equal distribution of resources. Okay. And this is then what other individuals developed into the notion of communism. Okay, the pure notion of communism is that everybody gives their resources to a central authority. And then in pure communism, what that central authority should do is then redistribute those resources equally and evenly among the population. Sounds utopic, sounds fair, sounds practical, but in the practice of things, if one central authority is getting all the resources and they get to decide how those resources are quote unquote equally distributed, you now have even a larger power difference between those who have and those who don't have. Okay. And that's one of the reasons that sociologists feel like most communist nations end up with systems much like North Korea, China, and Russia, is because all the power was given to that central authority, and it was assumed that they would equally distribute those resources. Okay. And so that's kind of the Karl Marx, though, just argued that it was social systems, not a central authority, that should be looking out for people. And there should be checks and balances between these systems and how those resources are distributed. Okay. So that was kind of his way to believe. And if you want to kind of think about Going back to conflict theory really quick, and social institutions are a reflection of competition. We can use social systems. You probably have heard of institutional racism and those types of things where it's the institution that creates the environment where discrimination can occur. Not necessarily the individuals, but the group of the institution creates the policies to make it so that people stay where they need to stay. And probably one of the more clear example is, for example, the welfare system and wages. Okay, is that it's argued that in a lot of especially labor positions, service positions, that really what you have to do is either you need to work three or four of those jobs, or you have to accept social services for it, for example, food stamps and food assistance. And that again is creating that much more of a power difference between those who have the corporation who is making the money off of the service or the labor, and making sure that the service and labor individuals don't have the opportunity to move upward or move out of that system. Okay. So I can't remember his name. It's a current sociologist that kind of made that analogy of the American labor system and how there's more and more discrepancies between those who have and those who don't have, and explaining it as institutional policies, such as the social welfare system, such as things like minimum wage and those types of things, to kind of show how even in a country like this, there's institutional policies that purposely discriminate between groups. Okay. So that's an example, again, going back to what Karl Marx was trying to say and how institutional kind of racism or prejudices can occur from the system itself. Okay. All right. So out of all this, there's basically these four principles. One is conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. There is an unequal because there's an unequal distribution of power in relationships. Okay, so for example, when we get to intimate relationships, okay, within a given culture, if it's a patriarchal system, power is unequally given to the man. If we're talking about a matriarchal system, more authority is given to the female. And so in either one of those systems, because of the power difference, it's going to be one individual that makes the majority of the decisions. Okay. Um, and of course, there is an ongoing struggle for scarce resources, and those who have the most power control the distribution of those resources. Okay. And that's the whole basis of kind of conflict theory. All right, and we will end with this today, is our last theory that we started on, which was symbolic interactionism. And this again focuses on the relationship between society and individuals via the use of language and symbols. Um, Also means that interaction notes, I'm reading my PowerPoint, how boring. Notes that individual activity shapes society and not just a passive respondent. So if you think about when this slide was made, do y'all remember that Tide Pod eating thing that was on social media? I'm trying to think of, yeah, I'm trying to think of some more recent ones. Well, trends on social media. I'll just use that broad term. When there's a trend on social media, that is actively changing the way we see society. So if you think about TikTok, all right, when I was a kid, you wouldn't do anything you do on TikTok, and record it. But today it's accepted to go on there and show people who you really are and, well, hopefully, and do trends and do those kinds of things. Okay. Um, and this symbolic interactionism brings up the issues of things like political correctness, right? Again, the example I used earlier is it's now unpopular to use the word homeless, and we're supposed to be using the term the unhoused, okay? Mainly because it was seen that the term homeless, one, came with negative connotations, but two, it also said that that person didn't deserve a home. They lacked a home. And for people in the political correctness, there's a difference between having a house, which is the physical structure, and having a home, which is the place you belong. Okay. And so that movement has been going on for several years now. Um, and I noticed that even the news over the last year has been using that term to, because as you all know, Tucson has a huge unhoused problem. And even the news has changed their terminology in exploring those issues in Tucson. Okay. Um, but the other thing that symbolic interactionism does is it is a powerful tool to persuade people to think a certain way about other groups, especially other groups that need to be seen as less than, negative, or are the competition for us. Okay. So, for example, one of the best ways to, for example, I think I used YouTube last Thursday, is dehumanization. The more you make a person look less than human, the more likely you're able to get someone to, for example, go to war after them, be prejudiced or discriminatory towards them. And just as some examples, this is an example of things that were used in World War II. As you can see, on our side, where good were virtuous. You have the angels, you have the woman coming and as a symbol of virtue and morals and values. And this is quote unquote us, of course, but the others are less than human. For example, this was a very common German propaganda for people in Britain is they were called English pigs. Um, and if we look at the gorilla and whatnot, making them less than human. Okay. And we're going to see here in just a minute that this has been used even in science to create discrimination, this dehumanization process. Okay. And, if we look at more close to home, we can see the quote unquote savage needing to be beat into um, 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 properness. We can see these were actually, this was actually a really famous comic book at the time about the red man who comes and rapes women and rapes the white women. If you look at this right here, this one is kind of an interesting one because this shows the natives hanging, of course, the white man and torturing him and the colonist. But in all actuality, the reality of this is they actually hanged the natives and beat them, but they changed it in their picture to make it look like what needed to happen to them was because of this, even though it was the other way around. Right? If we look at Buffalo Bill and his defeating of the Red Man, this was a very popular comic book in the late 1900s and clear up into the 1940s and 1950s. We can sell land because the people who are taking care of it, they're not doing such a good job. And so we need to go in and teach them how to take care of land. All right. Again, the idea is that making them less than human and making your group look like you are the humanitarian, and that the reason why we need to aggress towards these people is to save humanity and save our human virtues. You get that in the role book of people like Hitler. You get the role book in the early colonists here in the United States, and still some today. Well, not some. There seems to be a lot more than some. But anyways, you could see this in the playbook of many of the dictators in the world and whatnot, is just to really dehumanize the other group. If you look at, for example, political rhetoric, you hear a lot about, those dumb Democrats, those failures. It's always a derogatory term before stating the opposition's name. Sleepy Joe, I think it was, and all those kinds of things. All of the,
Something press secretary did with that reporter from Ireland.
yeah,
She did.
yeah, yeah, that's another good example. And again, all of these are meant to dehumanize, to take away their humanity, make them look worthless and not as good as the virtue of me. Okay. Um, so that symbolic interaction is, and we'll come back to this again when we talk a little bit later about things like discrimination and prejudice, why we go into warring factions and all that kind of stuff, why even a really decent person can be persuaded into doing something very awful. And we'll come back to mainly these processes when we discuss those things. Okay. All right, I did just want to mention, for example, one other theory, and then we'll close up for today. And that is in sociology, there's been a growing importance of using evolutionary theory to explain um, why societies and groups have developed and grown to where we are today. Okay. And so, real quick, the idea, evolution is the idea that animals and indeed humans evolved to survive in a given environmental context, thereby increasing the likelihood of passing on genetic material. Okay. And probably one example of how e- evolution versus social context matter and social definitions of things matter. And that is the example of skin color. Okay. In the United States, most prejudices are based upon skin color. Now, if you went to Canada, it's actually based on language. If you go to Mexico, a lot of prejudices are based kind of on skin color, but where your main historical ties come from. Does it come from mostly Mexico or does it come from mostly Spain? Um, and that's what prejudices are based upon in that country, is their origin of where they came from. And so, but in societies like ours, it's largely based on skin color and those who have light skin versus dark skin. But evolutionary theory teaches us that the purpose of skin color has to do with light and the amount of sunlight people get, with white individuals tending to historically come from the northern or southern parts of the hemisphere, and the skin color gets darker and darker as it gets to the equator. Because our main source of vitamin D is exposure to sunlight. And so lighter skinned people came from a place where you didn't get a lot of sunlight. And so when the light was out, you needed the best absorption rate you could get. Whereas if you get more towards the equator where the sun is very plentiful, your skin does not need to absorb as much sunlight, and so the skin naturally becomes darker over evolutionary periods. Okay. So it's not really based on a social aspect, it's based upon um, environmental demands for the human species. Okay. But this is where we can take evolutionary theory kind of to its bleak end, and probably very inappropriately. Something called social Darwinism, which was never coined by Charles Darwin. Indeed, the term survival of the fittest didn't come from Charles Darwin. It actually came from a sociologist, Herbert Spencer. And this is where, again, even something, this is going to be my example of how people can try and use science and this thing to even try and create prejudice as well, is the survival of the fittest assumes that um, the strongest, smartest, da da da, will survive, and the weak will diminish. All right. Some interesting facts about that, though, is that's not always true. Um, if we look, for example, at developmental theories about what is the highest thought process a man can get to or a human can get to, and it was assumed that being able to think in the abstract, right? Being able to not see things in white and black, but instead see things in the gray was the ultimate feat for human beings, and that they would survive. And other people who were not able to see that would not. But yet, that person with abstract thinking cannot survive in certain environments. They can't necessarily survive in a system where you have to literally know minute differences between leaves and which are edible and which are not edible. That you need to know minute pathways that tend to get overgrown very quickly, but you still need to maintain a mental map of how to get from point A to point B. And we find this very much with indigenous groups in the Amazon. You can't take your abstract thinker, if that is the highest thing, and put that person in the Amazon and expect them to survive. They won't unless they take, all their maps, their compasses, food, and they're still going to need a local guide. Okay. So what is so this idea of survival of the fittest is really a social construct for, again, people who want to maintain their authority and the way they think. Okay. And this actually ended up trying to be a scientific theory to explain the differences between people and the justification for racism. Because what they're going to do with this social Darwinism is they're going to take the development of a fetus into a baby, and they're going to note that when you develop in the womb, you basically go through all of the evolutionary stages of the species. So you start kind of like a little tadpole, you grow the spine, and then you kind of almost get into more like a shape of a reptile, and then you get into the shape of more of a primate, and then eventually you get into the shape of a small human being. What the social Darwinists argued is that certain people stop at different developmental rates. And of course, who comes out fully developed? White people. Okay. That it's only white people who come out fully developed and fully human. And then down that line is everyone else. So I think, for example, Black people, of course, were put at the lowest level. They actually argued that black people stop at the, the primate stage of development. And then I think it goes to the Mongolians, Asian, and there's a few in between, and then there's white people. And they truly tried to develop this idea that that's why white people should be in control because everyone else isn't quite human. Okay. They're just not there. Now, the interesting part is what they did with Native Americans here in the United States. They actually put Native Americans outside this developmental trajectory because they felt that Native Americans could become fully developed by listening to the white man. All the others, the Asians, the Mongolians, the blacks, there's nothing we can do about them. They're stuck at their developmental phase. But look how obedient we can make the native. Thank you for the eyebrow. But this, now, the ultimate end of these theories is going to end with the eugenics movement. Okay. This is going to be the sad part, but also luckily the end part of social Darwinism in the United States. Is eugenics is the belief that we can socially manufacture the best stock, the best people. So, for example, here in the United States, we started to sterilize especially violent offenders, but it just didn't end with them. It ended up being people who were poor, that just weren't making it well in the world. They especially started to pick on women who were minor offenders to some extent because they believed by stopping that genetic flow that would end those social problems. And that's the idea behind eugenics. Um, and fortunately, that ended when we realized that we can't socially manufacture people and whatnot. But my point in this section is that even things that start off on scientific, trying to understand the human condition, can be twisted and manipulated in order to fit someone's narrative. And that's what I would encourage you to be careful of when you're going through this class, is that a lot of these things can be used for good. And as we see with social Darwinism, pretty awful and awful thought processes. Okay. All right. I think we can stop there for today.